Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dives. I'm Waleed, and today we are diving deep into some fascinating developments in Morocco.
We're talking about a set of agreements coming out of their recent social dialogue.
Now, I know social dialogue, it doesn't exactly scream must listen, right?
But trust me on this one, folks. This stuff has some serious implications for the country.
We're talking potential shifts in income, taxes, pensions, even the right to strike.
Right. Exactly.
Big stuff. Luckily, you, our awesome listeners, sent over some excerpts from the agreement itself, plus a really helpful summary.
So we've got a lot to unpack, but thankfully I'm not alone in this deep dive. We've got an expert with us who can help us connect the dots and really understand what this all means for Morocco, both socially and economically. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me. I think to really grasp the significance here, we need to understand that this agreement isn't just some isolated event.
It's actually a chapter in a larger story, a continuation of some major commitments made back in April 2022.
Okay, so there's a backstory here. I like it. For those of us just joining the party, can you give us a quick rundown of who's involved in these discussions? Who are the key players at the table?
Absolutely. We're looking at what we call a tripartite agreement.
That means three key players. We've got the Moroccan government, obviously, but also, importantly, business groups like CGM and Commodore. They're representing the employers. And finally, we have the labor unions speaking on behalf of the workers.
Okay, so it's like a three-way negotiation. Everyone gets a seat at the table. That's pretty interesting. So it's not just the government calling all the shots then. You mentioned some earlier commitments. What were those about?
Right, so back in April 2022, they kind of set the stage with this thing called the Social Dialogue Charter.
It was essentially laying the groundwork for these kinds of discussions, setting the tone. They also started talking about income boosts for both public and private sector workers, which is obviously huge.
And they even started working on a regulatory law for the right to strike, which has been a long time coming. So this new agreement we're talking about today, it's like picking up where that one left off, building on that foundation.
Got it. So there's a foundation already in place, but let's get down to brass tacks here. What does this new agreement actually change? What are the big headlines?
Well, for many, it means more money in their pockets.
Now, that's something I think we can all get behind.
The agreement includes provisions for raises across different sectors.
Okay, let's break that down. Starting with the public sector, how much of a raise are we talking about?
So civil servants, they're looking at a 1,000 dirham increase per month.
But, and this is important, it's being implemented in 2 installments.
So they'll see the first 500 dirham bump in July 2024, and then the other half a year later in July 2025.
Okay, so a phased approach. Makes sense. I'm guessing that gives the government some breathing room to adjust budgets and whatnot, right?
But is that enough to keep pace with the cost of living? What's inflation looking like in Morocco these days?
That is the million dirham question, isn't it?
While a 1,000 dirham raise on paper sounds significant, whether it truly offsets the rising cost of living for these public sector workers, well, that remains to be seen.
We're going to need to keep a really close eye on how inflation evolves over the coming years.
Absolutely, because the economic reality on the ground, that's going to be a key factor. Okay, so that's the public sector. What about those working in the private sector? Any good news for them?
Absolutely. The agreement also mandates a 10% increase to both the minimum wage for non-agricultural work, that's known as the SMIG.
And for those working in the agricultural sector who are under what's called the SMAG.
Okay, hold on. Just so everyone's on the same page, can we clarify what SMIG and SMIG stand for?
Of course. SMIG is the Salaire Minimum Interprofessional Garantie, which, if my French still serves me right, means the Guaranteed Interprofessional Minimum Wage.
And it covers most sectors of the economy.
SMAG, on the other hand, is the Salaire Minimum Agricole Garantie. It's specifically for agricultural work.
Thanks for clarifying. So we're talking a 10% boost to both of those minimum wages. That's got to be a win for a lot of workers, right?
In theory, yes. But, and this is crucial, those increases are also being staggered over 2 years.
So for the SMIG, we're looking at a 5% increase slated for January 2025, with the remaining 5% kicking in a year later, January 2026.
For the SMAG, it's the same story, just shifted a few months later. 5% bump in April 2025, and then the final 5% in April 2026.
So similar to those public sector raises, a more gradual approach. I guess it's all about finding that balance, right? Providing some relief to workers, but also avoiding a sudden shock to businesses who have to, actually pay these wages.
Exactly. Gradual implementation gives businesses time to adjust, but it also means workers have to wait a little longer to see the full benefit. It's a trade-off, for sure, and it's definitely something we'll need to analyze closely as these changes are actually implemented.
Right, the devil's always in the details. Now, we're talking minimum wage here, which usually impacts those at the lower end of the income scale, right? What about those folks who are just above the minimum wage? Will they see any direct benefit from this agreement, or are they kind of left out in the cold?
That's where the tax changes come in.
Ooh, tax changes. Now we're talking.
This agreement, it actually lays out a pretty substantial revamp of the income tax system, and it all kicks off in January 2025.
Okay, a tax revamp, huh? Give us the good stuff. What are they changing?
Well, first off, they're raising that income tax exemption threshold.
Okay, and a reminder for our listeners, what does that mean exactly?
So right now, it kicks in at 30,000 dirhams per year.
But under this new agreement, that threshold going up to 40,000 dirhams.
Okay, so if you're earning less than 40,000 dirhams annually, you are off the hook, no income tax.
You got it.
That's huge. How many people are we talking of here? I mean, what does that actually mean for the average person in Morocco?
It's a significant chunk of the population. Just to give you an idea, anyone earning around 6,000 dirhams or less per month, they're going to see that benefit.
Wow, no income tax at all. That's got to make a real difference in people's lives, especially for those who are just scraping by. But I'm guessing they're not stopping there, right? What about folks who are earning a bit more, say, above that 40,000 dirham threshold?
You're right, they haven't forgotten about them. The agreement also includes some pretty interesting changes to the income tax brackets, especially for the middle class.
Okay, color me intrigued. What are we talking about here?
They're actually aiming to cut the tax rate for middle-income earners by about 50%.
Whoa, 50%. That's what we call a tax break. But hold on a second. Middle class, that can be a pretty broad term. Do we know exactly what income range that covers?
That's a really important question. And to be honest, the agreement itself, it's a bit vague on those specifics.
How so?
It doesn't explicitly define those income bands. So whether this 50% reduction, does it apply to a narrow band of incomes or a wider range? That's something we'll need to keep a close eye on as more details emerge. But it's definitely something that anyone in that kind of middle income bracket should be paying attention to.
Absolutely, because as they say, the devil's in the details. Still, a potential 50% tax cut, that's a pretty big deal. Okay, so we've got lower income folks benefiting from that higher exemption threshold, potentially a windfall for the middle class. What about higher earners? Are they getting anything out of this agreement?
Well, they haven't been completely ignored. The agreement proposes a slight reduction to the marginal tax rate.
Okay, refresher time for those of us who haven't brushed up on our tax jargon lately.
Right.
What exactly is the marginal tax rate again?
It's basically the rate that's applied to the highest portion of your income.
Right.
So as you earn more, that rate, it climbs higher.
Right. The more you make, the more they take.
Yeah.
So how much are they shaving off this marginal rate?
It's a small decrease, from 38% down to 37%.
Okay, I got to be honest. 1% doesn't exactly sound earth-shattering at first glance. Help me understand this. Why does this matter?
It's all about the bigger picture. For someone in that higher income bracket, even a 1% reduction, it can actually translate to significant savings, especially when you factor in the time element, over the years. We're talking about a system where even small percentages can add up to some pretty substantial sums.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about the percentage itself. It's about the amount of income that percentage is being applied to.
Exactly.
A small tweak for some, a noticeable difference for others.
Precisely. It's all about perspective and, really understanding the nuances of these changes.
Speaking of nuances, there's one more piece of the tax puzzle we need to put in place here: family deductions. What's the deal with those?
Another crucial change. They're increasing the deduction per dependent from 360 dirhams to a more generous 500 dirhams.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that actually mean for families, especially those with several kids?
Essentially, families can deduct more money from their taxable income for every child or dependent they have. So, a family with 2 children, for example, would be eligible for a 1,000 dirham deduction.
That's a significant jump from the previous 720 dirhams they would have received. That's got to be music to the ears of a lot of families out there, especially those who are struggling to, put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads.
Absolutely. It's a way for the government to provide some targeted financial relief and potentially boost the disposable income of families, which can have ripple effects throughout the economy.
So lower taxes, higher deductions on paper. It sounds like a pretty sweet deal for a lot of Moroccans. But let's be real, promises are one thing, actual implementation, that's a whole other ballgame. What's your take on the feasibility of all of this? Can they actually deliver on these promises?
Well, let's just say these are some pretty ambitious goals, and whether they succeed or not, well, it's going to depend on a lot of factors.
Such as,
Political will, economic stability, how effectively these changes are actually implemented. It's still a bit early to say for sure how this is all going to play out in the long run, but it's definitely something we'll be watching very, very closely.
absolutely. We'll be sure to keep our listeners updated as things progress. Now, speaking of big changes and, potential challenges, we can't forget about the elephant in the room, pension reform. This agreement hints at some pretty substantial changes there. Fill us in. What's the deal with pensions?
This is a big one. Honestly, I think this could have major, major ramifications for years to come.
Okay, so no pressure then.
The agreement outlines a move towards a two-pillar pension system. And that, my friend, is a pretty significant shift from the current model.
Okay, hold on. I'm getting flashbacks to my ancient history classes here. Two-pillar system. It sounds like something Julius Caesar came up with. Break it down for us. What does that even mean? And what's the rationale behind it?
All right, so imagine this, right? Instead of relying solely on the existing public pension system, the one where the government essentially manages this big pot of money that gets paid out to retirees when they hit a certain age.
Right, the classic model.
This new model, it would incorporate a public component, but also a private one.
Interesting. So it's like a mix of the old and the new. What's the thinking behind adding that private element into the mix? Why fix what's not broken, as they say? Or I guess in this case, what might be a little bit broken.
Well, one of the main arguments you hear is that it could lead to greater financial sustainability in the long run, especially as the population ages and people are living longer.
Makes sense. More people drawing pensions for longer periods. That puts a strain on any system.
Exactly, and that's where that private component comes in. Because if you have individuals also contributing to their own retirement savings, well, that could take some of the pressure off that public system.
Okay, I get it. It's like diversifying the portfolio, so to speak.
Exactly.
But this whole two-pillar thing, it also raises a bunch of other questions. How would the private side of things actually work? Would everyone be required to contribute to private pension funds? What happens to those who, maybe they can't afford to contribute much, or those who are already retired or nearing retirement? I mean, there are a lot of moving pieces here.
You're hitting all the key points. And the truth is, the agreement itself, it's actually pretty vague on the specifics. They're leaving a lot of those thornier questions for future discussions.
So a bit of a cliffhanger on the pension front. We do know that the agreement stresses the protection of what they call acquired rights. What does that actually mean in practice? How does that safeguard people who are already receiving pensions or who are, maybe a year away from retirement?
That's a really crucial point. Essentially, it's about reassuring people that this isn't about taking away benefits they've already earned. Protecting acquired rights, it means that anyone currently receiving a pension or who has contributed to the system and is nearing retirement age, they won't suddenly see their pensions slashed or taken away under this new system. Their benefits, they're locked in.
That's a huge relief because these kinds of, major overhauls, they can create a lot of uncertainty, anxiety, rightfully so. People need those guarantees. Still, it leaves a lot of details up in the air. What's the timeline for ironing out all this pension stuff?
The agreement states that they're aiming to hammer out, like a unified vision for this pension reform by September 2024, with the goal of presenting it to Parliament for approval during their October 2024 session.
Okay, so a pretty tight turnaround. It'll be interesting to see what they come up with and how this all shakes out. But let's shift gears a bit to another biggie, the right to strike. This has been a point of contention for a while now. What's the latest?
You're right. It's a very sensitive issue, one that requires a very delicate balancing act.
The agreement does mention that they're finally moving forward with drafting a law that will clearly define the conditions and procedures for exercising the right to strike.
Okay. And what's the overall objective here? Is it to restrict the right to strike or to protect it? What's the angle?
It's more about finding that sweet spot, that balance between protecting workers' rights, because the right to strike, it's a fundamental labor right.
Absolutely.
But also addressing these concerns about potential disruptions, especially to essential services.
Right, because if the entire country grinds to a halt, that's not good for anyone.
Exactly. So they want to make sure that, while workers have that right, that there are also mechanisms in place to ensure things like hospitals, emergency services, that those can continue to function even during a strike.
Yeah, striking that balance is never easy. What specific aspects will this law address? What are the sticking points, the areas where they might run into some resistance?
Well, for one, they want to clearly define what constitutes essential services.
Okay, so those are the ones that absolutely cannot be disrupted under any circumstances.
Exactly, the ones that are absolutely essential for public safety, for well-being. They also want to clarify the very definition of a strike itself. When is it considered legal and when is it not?
Because there's a difference.
Huge difference. And of course, they're putting a lot of emphasis on dialogue, conciliation, mediation, all those good things as ways to hopefully resolve these disputes before they escalate into those full-blown strikes.
So a lot of ground to cover, but it sounds like they're at least trying to approach this from multiple angles, involve all the stakeholders. When can we expect to see this law in action?
They're aiming to finalize the draft through, continued consultations and hopefully get it passed during the spring 2024 parliamentary session.
Okay, so another deadline on the horizon. This is definitely a developing story. We'll be following it closely. But we've covered income changes, this whole pension system shakeup, the right to strike. Anything else in this agreement that's worth mentioning?
There is one more area, and it's a big one, potential revisions to the labor code itself.
Ah, yes. The labor code, that's the bedrock, the foundation of all worker protections and rights in Morocco. What kind of changes are we talking about here?
At this point, it's less about specific changes and more about a commitment to review and potentially update certain aspects of the labor code.
Okay.
They're talking about a participatory approach to find, again, that sweet spot between, supporting businesses and ensuring worker well-being.
So again, finding that balance, those are all laudable goals, of course, but also pretty vague. Any hints about what areas of the labor code they might be looking to revise? What are the pain points that they're really trying to address?
Well, they're keeping their cards pretty close to their chest for now. But they do specifically mention tackling job insecurity and promoting what they call decent employment.
Okay, so buzzwords like job security, decent employment, all good things in theory. But what do those actually look like in practice? What concrete changes might we see down the line?
That's the million dirham question, isn't it? I mean, given the emphasis on job security, it wouldn't be surprising to see some discussions around things like fixed-term contracts, temporary work, and maybe even aspects related to dismissals and severance pay.
So really diving into the nitty-gritty of how jobs are defined and protected.
Exactly. There's also that mention of reviewing the whole framework for professional training.
Which suggests to me that they're thinking about, how to better equip workers with the skills they need for a job market that's constantly changing and evolving.
Makes sense. Investing in people, it's always a good strategy in my book. All right, we've covered a ton of ground here. Income, pensions, strikes, labor laws. It's a lot to process.
It really highlights the breadth of this agreement and the potential impact, I think, it could have on Moroccan society as a whole.
Absolutely. Before we let our listeners go and digest all of this, let's zoom out for a second and talk about accountability. Because each party has made commitments, right? So who's responsible for making sure all of this actually happens?
Well, it's a joint effort, that's for sure. The government has committed to, actually implementing these changes.
So putting your money where their mouth is.
Exactly. Drafting the laws, allocating the necessary resources, all of that. But businesses and those labor unions, they've also got roles to play.
Right. It's a two-way street, or I guess in this case a three-way street, given that we've got our three players here. What are the main responsibilities of the business groups and the labor unions?
On the business side, CGM and Comotter have agreed to actually implement those wage increases. They're going to participate constructively in the discussions around pension reform and the right to strike.
And they're going to engage in good faith negotiations for those collective bargaining agreements.
And what about the labor unions? What are they on the hook for?
Their side of the bargain includes respecting those agreed upon timelines, actively participating in finalizing the details around those pensions and the right to strike, and basically coming to the table in good faith when it comes to negotiating any of those changes to the labor code.
So everyone has a stake in this. Everyone has a role to play. It's a shared responsibility to make sure that these promises actually translate into real, tangible change for the people of Morocco. Any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
It's too early to say for sure whether this agreement will actually, usher in this new era for Morocco, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. The key will be monitoring how these changes are implemented, who actually benefits the most, and whether those ambitious timelines, whether they're actually met. Transparency and accountability, I think those are going to be absolutely paramount.
I couldn't agree more. Lots to watch, analyze, and discuss in the coming months and years. And this is one of those deep dives where, we've really just scratched the surface. We'll definitely be revisiting this topic as things develop. But for now, we want to hear from you, our listeners. What stood out to you from all of this? Which of these changes do you think will have the biggest impact on the lives of everyday Moroccans? Head over to our website, check out those show notes for links to all the source documents, and let us know what you think. Until next time, keep diving deep,